General Marcus Ralston knelt in chains, his breath ragged, the taste of blood thick on his tongue. The cold metal floor beneath him was slick with his own sweat, and the sterile, white glow of the interrogation chamber cast long shadows against the walls. His wrists, raw from the restraints, trembled slightly, though not from weakness. He refused to give them the satisfaction. Across from him, Lord Valtherin observed with quiet amusement. Dressed in the dark regalia of the Galactic Empire's High Inquisitors, the alien's expression was unreadable, save for the flicker of something like curiosity in his crimson eyes. He stepped forward, his boots echoing in the silent chamber, and tilted his head. "You are a stubborn creature," Valtherin mused. "Humans are fragile things, yet you endure. I wonder, do you believe your suffering has meaning?" Marcus forced a grin through split lips. "I was just wondering the same about your existence." The blow came swift. A backhand across his face sent him sprawling onto the floor. Pain exploded in his jaw, but Marcus refused to cry out. He pushed himself up, feeling the weight of his restraints dragging at his limbs. The room swayed, the edges of his vision swimming in black. Valtherin sighed. "You mistake defiance for strength, General. The rebellion is finished. Your forces scatter like vermin, your worlds burn, and yet here you kneel, clutching at illusions. Tell me, where is the last human fleet?" Marcus exhaled slowly. He could hear the subtle frustration in Valtheron's voice beneath the practiced control. That was something. The Empire had spent weeks trying to break him, but they didn't realize that suffering was an old companion of his. He had endured starvation on war-torn colonies, fought battles with shattered ribs, watched entire planets fall to the Empire's unrelenting grip. He would not be the one to deliver the final nail in humanity's coffin. Valtherin nodded to the technicians in the room. At his signal, the machines flared to life, and agony surged through Marcus's body. Every nerve screamed as volts of electricity coursed through him, his muscles locking in place, his heart hammering as if trying to escape his ribs. His breath came in short, desperate bursts, but he gritted his teeth, refusing to give them what they wanted. The pain subsided, leaving him gasping. Valtherin crouched beside him, his voice almost gentle. "It would be easier to give in. I can make it painless." Marcus spat blood onto the Inquisitor's pristine boots. "You first." Valtherin sighed, rising to his full height. "So be it." The torture continued. They beat him, burned him, injected him with serums that made his skin feel as if it were peeling from his bones. He lost count of the days, if they even bothered marking them in this lightless prison. Sometimes they let him heal, feeding him just enough to keep him alive before starting again. Other times, they left him in isolation, the silence stretching endlessly, an abyss in which even his thoughts began to turn against him. But he did not break. Then, one day, they decided they had waited long enough. Marcus was dragged to the center of the chamber, barely able to stand. His body was failing him, and he knew it. His vision blurred, his legs weak beneath him. He had held on for as long as he could. Perhaps this was the end. Valtherin stood before him, hands clasped behind his back. "You have been an admirable opponent, General Ralston. It is a shame to end this." A sharp, cold pressure at his chest. Marcus looked down to see the Inquisitor's blade piercing his heart. He gasped, the world tilting. Pain, sudden and absolute, filled his body, but only for a moment. His legs buckled, his breath hitched, and then, darkness, silence, nothing. And then, he woke. Air flooded his lungs as though he had been drowning. His fingers twitched against the cold floor. Light seared his vision. For a moment, he was sure he was dreaming, trapped in some dying hallucination. Then he heard the voices. He was dead. Panic, fear, not his, the guards. Marcus sat up. He shouldn't have been able to. He had felt the blade. He had felt death. But now he was here whole. His chest ached where the blade had pierced him. But there was no wound, no blood. He turned his head. The guards stood frozen in shock. Valtherin was among them. His eyes narrowed in something dangerously close to unease. Marcus flexed his fingers. He could feel his strength returning more than before. His mind felt clearer, sharper. The pain, the exhaustion, all of it was gone. He stood, the chains falling from his wrists. "Contain him!" Valtherin barked, snapping the guards out of their trance. They moved to restrain him. Marcus moved faster. Marcus did not think. He reacted. His body moved with a speed and precision that should have been impossible, especially after what had just happened. The guards barely had time to register his movement before he was among them. His hands a blur as he twisted a rifle from the nearest soldier's grip. The moment his fingers wrapped around the cold metal, something in his muscles ignited, like an instinct honed over a lifetime but sharpened beyond anything human. He fired. The first guard fell before he could even raise his weapon. Marcus pivoted, swinging the rifle like a club, cracking another soldier's helmet. He grabbed the man's fallen sidearm mid-motion, spun, and shot 2 more troopers through the visor. The last guard hesitated, his blaster trembling in his grip. Marcus lunged forward, wrenching the weapon from his hands before slamming the man's head into the wall. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus turned slowly. Valtherin had not moved. The Inquisitor's expression remained unreadable, but his fingers twitched slightly at his side. The alien was rattled. "You should not be alive," Valtherin murmured, studying him as if he were some experiment that had exceeded expectations. Marcus flexed his hands. His mind buzzed with clarity. Every sense was heightened. The air smelled sharp with the tang of burnt ozone from the blaster fire. He could hear the faint hum of the station's energy core beneath the floor panels. Even his body, healed, strong, brimming with something he could not explain, felt foreign yet entirely his. "I'll admit," Marcus said, stepping toward Valtherin, "I'm as surprised as you are." The Inquisitor's eyes flickered. Then he moved. The blade was in Valtherin's hand in an instant, slashing toward Marcus's throat. But Marcus saw it coming, not just the motion but the intent behind it. His body reacted before his mind fully processed the danger. He ducked, the blade slicing the air where his neck had been, and countered with a strike to Valtherin's ribs. The Inquisitor staggered but did not fall. "You're fast," Valtherin admitted, rolling his shoulders. "Stronger than before, but you're still human." Marcus smiled. "Am I?" He rushed forward, feinting left before pivoting and striking low. Valtherin barely blocked in time, his blade parrying the blow, but Marcus was already moving again, pressing the advantage. Their battle was a blur of motion. Strike, parry, dodge, counter. The Inquisitor fought with deadly grace, but for the first time, Marcus felt as if he were no longer at a disadvantage. Then the alarms blared. Reinforcements. Marcus knew he had seconds before the chamber flooded with soldiers. He needed an escape. His eyes darted to the control panel near the exit. If he could override the lockdown. A sudden force slammed into his chest, sending him sprawling across the room. He hit the floor hard, skidding to a stop against the cold metal wall. Valtherin stood over him, his blade crackling with energy. "You are different," the Inquisitor said, "but not invincible." Marcus gritted his teeth, forcing himself to his feet. His ribs should have been broken, his lungs gasping for air. Instead, he felt the pain fade almost instantly, his body recovering faster than should have been possible. He met Valtherin's gaze, and for the first time, he saw something new behind those crimson eyes. Doubt. Then Marcus moved. He didn't think. He acted. His hand shot forward, grabbing the wrist of Valtherin's sword arm. He twisted, pulling the Inquisitor off balance, then drove his knee into the alien's abdomen. Valtherin grunted but didn't fall. Marcus released his grip, spun behind him, and struck at the control panel with the stolen blaster. The console sparked, the door hissed open, and Marcus was already running. The corridor ahead stretched in both directions. Red emergency lights bathed the walls in a pulsing glow. He had no plan, no destination, only the undeniable need to get out. Footsteps thundered behind him. The Empire's response was swift. He dove into the nearest open doorway, rolling into a maintenance tunnel just as blaster fire sizzled past his head. The heat singed the side of his face, but the pain was fleeting. He kept moving, sprinting through the narrow passage, his mind racing. He needed a ship. Navigating the station's labyrinthine layout should have been impossible, but somehow Marcus knew exactly where to go. It was as if the blueprints had been burned into his memory. He took a sharp turn, sprinting toward the docking bay. A squad of troopers blocked his path. They fired in unison. Marcus dropped low, rolling beneath the barrage before springing forward. He grabbed one soldier by the arm, twisted the blaster from his grip, and fired in a single fluid motion. The others barely had time to react before they fell. A stolen keycard got him into the hangar. Rows of Imperial fighters and transport vessels lined the docking bay. Alarms blared overhead, automated turrets locking onto him. He ran. A sleek Imperial dropship sat near the launch doors. A pilot stood by the ramp, frantically speaking into a communicator. Marcus didn't slow. He leapt, tackling the man to the ground. Before the pilot could shout, Marcus drove his elbow into his temple. The body went limp. He dragged the unconscious soldier up the ramp and into the cockpit. The controls were foreign yet familiar. His fingers moved instinctively across the console. The engines roared to life. Outside, stormtroopers flooded the hangar, weapons raised. The first shots ricocheted off the hull as Marcus engaged the thrusters. The ship lifted, its underbelly cannons spitting fire, scattering the soldiers. The hangar doors began to close. Marcus gripped the controls, angled the nose of the ship upward, and pushed the engines to maximum. The ship shot forward, squeezing through the narrowing gap just as the doors slammed shut behind it. He was free, but as he stared at the vast expanse of space stretching before him, a single question gnawed at the edges of his mind. What had he become? The void of space stretched infinitely before Marcus, the stars cold and distant. The hum of the ship's engines was the only sound in the cockpit, but his mind was far from silent. His hands tightened on the controls, his knuckles white. Every breath he took felt too steady, too controlled, as if his body no longer belonged to him. He had died. He had felt it. Felt the blade pierce his heart. Felt the life drain from his limbs. And yet here he was, stronger, faster, more alive than he had ever been. The ship's console flickered with proximity alerts. He wasn't alone. Imperial fighters were inbound, their sleek forms emerging from the darkness, weapons armed. They had anticipated his escape. Marcus exhaled sharply, his thoughts snapping into focus. He could feel their movements before they made them, the way they shifted information, the way their targeting systems locked onto him. He pulled the ship into a sharp dive, the gravitational force pressing him into his seat as plasma bolts streaked past. The console lit up with damage warnings, but Marcus barely registered them. His body moved with an instinct he did not understand, his reflexes sharper than should have been possible. He twisted the ship into a spiral, dodging another volley of fire, then cut the thrusters for a split second. The sudden loss of momentum sent him plummeting toward a nearby asteroid field. The fighters pursued, their pilots reacting a fraction too slow. Marcus weaved between the floating debris, his ship skimming dangerously close to the jagged rocks. The enemy pilots followed, but one by one they miscalculated. The first clipped an asteroid, spinning out of control before erupting in a fireball. The second hesitated a moment too long, just enough for Marcus to pull an impossible turn and fire directly into its cockpit. The last fighter remained, more cautious than the others. Marcus angled his ship, forcing the pilot into a chase. He led him through the tightest spaces, testing his reactions, waiting for the moment to strike. Then, without warning, Marcus cut the ship's thrusters entirely. The enemy fighter shot past him, its pilot unable to compensate in time. Marcus re-engaged his engines, lined up his sights, and fired. The last ship exploded into a burst of flame and metal. The battle was over. Marcus took a shaky breath. He had no right to have survived that. His skills had always been exceptional, but this was something else. He had moved like a machine, his reactions beyond human. His thoughts turned back to the moment he had woken in that cold, sterile room. He should have been dead. He had died. And yet he was here. A soft chime from the console pulled him back. An incoming transmission. Not Imperial. He hesitated before opening the channel. The screen flickered, revealing a familiar face. Captain Elise Varen. One of the last leaders of the human resistance. Her sharp green eyes studied him with a mixture of shock and suspicion. Marcus. Her voice was laced with disbelief. We thought you were dead. He almost laughed. So did I. Elise's gaze flickered to the background of his cockpit, noting the Imperial design. You stole one of their ships. How the hell did you escape? Marcus hesitated. He didn't know how to answer that. He wasn't sure he even wanted to. Instead, he said, I'll explain when I see you. Where are you? Elise exhaled, debating something silently. Finally, she said, sending coordinates now. But Marcus, if you're compromised. I'm not. She studied him for a long moment before nodding. The transmission cut out, and coordinates flashed onto his screen. He set course, but a weight settled in his chest. If he wasn't compromised, then what was he? The journey took hours, but Marcus barely noticed. His mind raced through the memories of his last moments in that Imperial prison, the way his body had broken and then somehow repaired itself. It wasn't natural. It wasn't possible. The resistance outpost was hidden in the remnants of a shattered moon, its base concealed beneath layers of rock and electromagnetic interference. Marcus piloted through the maze-like tunnels, finally emerging into a cavernous hangar where resistance fighters moved quickly, weapons trained on his ship. He stepped out slowly, hands visible. Elise stood at the front of the welcoming party, her expression unreadable. The moment he set foot on solid ground, she strode forward and pulled him into a tight embrace. For a dead man, you look pretty damn good, she murmured. He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Wish I could say the same about how I feel. She pulled back, studying his face. Talk. Marcus glanced at the gathered soldiers, then back at Elise. Not here. She nodded and led him into the depths of the base. They entered a small, dimly lit chamber, her personal quarters, judging by the scattered maps and data pads. She sealed the door behind them, then folded her arms. Now tell me. Marcus took a deep breath and told her everything. The torture, the death, the impossible resurrection. The way he felt stronger, faster, the way his body no longer obeyed the limits of human nature. Elise listened without interrupting, but her eyes darkened as he spoke. When he finished, she turned, staring at the wall in deep thought. Say something, Marcus said. She turned back to him. You said Valtherin was there? Marcus nodded. Elise exhaled sharply. That bastard's been experimenting on prisoners for years. But resurrection. She shook her head. That's not Empire technology. That's something else. A silence stretched between them. Finally, Marcus said, If they did something to me, I need to know what. Elise nodded. And we need to know if they can do it again to others. A sudden explosion rocked the base. Alarms blared. Elise's communicator crackled to life. Incoming attack. Imperial forces breached the outer defenses. Marcus and Elise locked eyes. The Empire had followed him. There was no time for doubt. No time for questions. Marcus grabbed a rifle from the rack, the weight of it familiar in his hands. Whatever had happened to him, whatever he had become, he would find out later. Right now, he had a war to win. The ground shook as another explosion tore through the resistance base. The air filled with the acrid stench of burning metal and the frantic shouts of soldiers scrambling into defensive positions. Marcus gripped his rifle, the cold weight of it settling into his hands like an old companion. The echoes of battle rang through the tunnels as Elise's voice crackled through the base-wide comms. All units, defensive formation. Hold them at the choke points. We cannot let them reach the command center. Marcus followed her out of the chamber and into the chaos. The dim corridors flickered with emergency lights, casting jagged shadows against the walls. Resistance fighters rushed past, weapons at the ready, faces set in grim determination. They had fought off Imperial assaults before, but this was different. This attack wasn't just a routine purge. It was precise, deliberate. They had come for him. Blaster fire erupted ahead, sharp bursts of red and blue flashing in the darkness. The front lines had engaged. Marcus sprinted toward the sound, Elise at his side, her pistol drawn. They reached the barricades where resistance fighters huddled behind makeshift cover, firing into the approaching enemy lines. The Imperials advanced with ruthless efficiency, their armored boots pounding against the stone floor, their formations tight, methodical. A squad of stormtroopers breached the perimeter. Marcus didn't hesitate. He vaulted over the barricade, landing in a controlled roll. Before the first trooper could react, Marcus was already moving. His rifle kicked against his shoulder as he fired, dropping the closest soldier with a precise shot to the visor. He spun, avoiding a blast that seared past his ribs, then closed the distance to the next target. His movements were fluid, faster than should have been possible. He wrenched the blaster from the trooper's hands, twisted, and used the stolen weapon to take down another enemy before they could react. Something inside him had changed. It wasn't just speed or strength. It was perception. He saw the fight before it happened, his mind calculating every movement, every angle. It was more than instinct, it was certainty. Elise shouted his name, and he turned just in time to see an Imperial officer raising a high-energy disruptor. Marcus moved before the shot was fired, a blur of motion that carried him across the battlefield. He tackled the officer, driving him to the ground. The man's eyes widened in shock, but before he could react, Marcus drove his fist into his temple. The body went limp. Elise caught up to him, panting. "That was reckless," she snapped. Marcus shook his head. "It was necessary." She looked at him hard, eyes searching his face. "Something's different about you." He didn't answer. He didn't know how to. The battle raged on, but the resistance forces were losing ground. The Imperials pressed forward, their reinforcements seemingly endless. One by one, the outer defenses collapsed. Then, the walls trembled with a sound deeper than any explosion. Presence. A force that sent a chill through the air. Valtherin had arrived. The Imperial Inquisitor strode through the carnage, untouched by the battle around him. His crimson eyes locked onto Marcus, and for the first time, Marcus felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, but recognition. Valtherin raised a hand, and the battlefield seemed to still. Soldiers, both Imperial and Resistance, hesitated, sensing the shift in the air. A force, unseen yet undeniable, pressed down upon Marcus, heavy and absolute. "You are not what you were," Valtherin said, his voice carrying through the chamber. "And yet, you do not understand what you have become." Marcus clenched his fists. "Then why don't you enlighten me?" Valtherin smiled, slow and deliberate. "Very well." The Inquisitor moved with inhuman speed, his blade igniting in a flash of violet energy. Marcus barely dodged the first strike, the weapon slicing through the space where his neck had been a fraction of a second earlier. He countered, striking at Valtheron's midsection, but the Inquisitor twisted effortlessly, avoiding the blow. They clashed, their movements a blur of speed and precision. Sparks flew as blade met rifle, as fists connected with armor. Each strike was calculated, each counter perfectly timed. Marcus knew how this fight should go. He should be losing. He should be overwhelmed. But he wasn't. He matched Valtheron's speed, matched his strength, matched his precision, and that was what unsettled him most. Valtherin seemed almost pleased. "Now do you see?" the Inquisitor mused, parrying another strike. "You are not merely alive, Marcus Ralston. You have been remade." Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't. The words lodged in his throat. A sudden explosion rocked the chamber. Elise had detonated the structural charges along the eastern corridor, collapsing part of the tunnel to cut off the reinforcements. Dust and debris clouded the air, momentarily breaking Valtheron's focus. Marcus seized the opening. He drove his shoulder into the Inquisitor's chest, forcing him back. Then, without hesitation, he grabbed the nearest fallen stormtrooper's thermal detonator, activated it, and hurled it at Valtheron's feet. The explosion consumed the space between them. Marcus didn't wait to see the result. He turned and ran, grabbing Elisa's arm and pulling her with him. "We have to go. Now." The resistance forces were already retreating, falling back to the emergency evacuation tunnels. Elise shouted commands into her communicator, directing the remaining fighters toward the escape shuttles. As they ran, Marcus felt something stir in the back of his mind. Presence. A whisper. It wasn't Valtheron. It wasn't human. It was something else. Something inside him. And it was awake.